The question arrives at some point for almost everyone who takes their working life seriously. What is my calling? The word itself carries enormous weight, the implication that somewhere in the world there is a singular purpose that belongs specifically to you, and that your task is to find it, commit to it, and build your life around it. The romantic appeal of this idea is not difficult to understand. It offers resolution to the ambiguity of having to choose among many possible paths. It provides a criterion. This is my calling. That simplifies the complicated work of building a working life. And it frames the question of career not as a strategic decision, but as a form of self-discovery, which makes it feel more meaningful than the alternatives. The problem is that the evidence for the calling model, the idea that each person has a single vocation that is uniquely suited to them, and that finding and following it is the path to professional fulfillment, is surprisingly weak. The research on how meaningful careers actually develop, how professional identity forms, and what predicts long-term career satisfaction consistently tells a different story. And the calling myth's consequences, for the people who most deeply believe in it, are often seriously harmful. They produce paralysis in people who haven't found their calling yet, guilt in people who have found something that works but doesn't feel uniquely destined, and the persistent, undermining suspicion that any given career path might be the wrong one if the right one hasn't been definitively identified. Understanding what the research actually shows about how careers develop is the first step toward building a professional life that is genuinely satisfying, rather than one that is perpetually deferred pending the arrival of a calling that may not exist in the form we were taught to expect. David Epstein's research on the development of expertise and professional identity provides the empirical foundation for this challenge to the calling model. His book Range, which synthesized decades of research on how exceptional performers in complex domains actually developed, made a central argument that applies directly to career development, the path to genuine professional mastery in wicked domains, domains with changing rules, ambiguous feedback, and complex, unpredictable challenges, almost always runs through a period of broad sampling rather than early focused commitment. The data Epstein assembled was striking. Athletes who diversified their sports experience before specializing outperformed early specialists in their eventual primary sport. Scientists who had worked across multiple fields before focusing made disproportionate contributions to breakthrough discoveries. Professionals who had accumulated diverse experiences before finding their primary domain brought what Epstein calls analogical thinking, the capacity to apply frameworks and solutions from one domain to problems in another that pure specialists embedded in a single field typically cannot access. The breadth was not despite their eventual depth, it was the foundation for it. For career development, the implication is pointed. The calling model inverts the actual sequence of how meaningful work tends to develop. It assumes that the calling comes first, that you identify the right vocation and then build competence in it. The research suggests that for most people in most complex domains, the sequence works the other way. Competence develops through exploration. Genuine interest deepens as competence grows. The sense of meaningful purpose that looks like a calling from the outside is usually the product of accumulated investment and skill development, not the prior condition for it. Herminia Ibarra's research on working identity adds the psychological dimension that Epstein's population-level findings need. Ibarra, who spent decades studying how professionals navigate significant career transitions, found that the self-knowledge needed to make meaningful career choices is almost never available in advance of the experiences that generate it. People do not discover who they are professionally and then find the right career expression of that identity. They develop working identities through experimentation, through trying different kinds of work, different roles, different organizational contexts, and the identity that eventually coheres is the product of that accumulated experience, not its prerequisite. This finding directly challenges one of the calling model's most persistent claims, that the way to find your calling is to look inward, to do the deep work of self-examination, to identify your deepest values and authentic nature, and find the professional expression of those. Ibarra's research showed that this introspective approach, while not useless, is substantially less effective than the alternative she calls outsight. The specific kind of self-knowledge that comes from engaging with the world, trying things, observing your responses to different kinds of work, and building your professional identity outward from experience rather than inward from pre-experience contemplation. The person who has spent years waiting to feel called, doing the inner work, looking for the sign of authentic vocation, is often worse positioned to make a good career choice than the person who has spent those years in active exploration of different kinds of work, developing genuine competence in multiple areas, and accumulating the experimental evidence that genuine self-knowledge about work requires. Cal Newport's research on career satisfaction provides the third dimension of the case against the calling model, and it is in some ways the most practically useful. Newport's central finding, documented across multiple studies of highly satisfied professionals, was that career satisfaction is almost never the product of having found a pre-existing passion and following it. It is the product of achieving mastery, and specifically, the state that happens when skills become genuinely rare and valuable. Newport calls this craftsman capital, the skills, knowledge, and capabilities that become genuinely compelling to other people, and that give the person who has them real leverage in shaping their professional life. The follow your passion advice, Newport argued, gets the causation backwards. Passion is typically not the driver of skill development, it is the consequence of it. The person who has developed genuine mastery in a domain, who can do things that others cannot do, who has accumulated the specific competencies that make their work difficult to replace, finds themselves caring deeply about that work in ways they almost certainly would not have predicted before the mastery developed. The rare and valuable skills are intrinsically motivating in ways that average performance is not. The calling that passionate professionals describe is usually not what led them to their mastery. It is what the mastery eventually produced. This sequence, invest in skills, accumulate craftsman capital, use that capital to gain autonomy, and build work that is genuinely satisfying, is not as romantically appealing as the calling model. It lacks the drama of the discovery, the moment of clarity, the decisive revelation of vocation. It is incremental, patient, and unglamorous, but it is substantially more reliable than waiting for a calling that the evidence suggests may not arrive in the form that the calling model promises. What does this mean practically for the person navigating the real challenges of building a professional life? The first implication is to treat the early career as a sampling period, rather than as a failed search for the calling. The diverse experiences that feel like inability to commit may be, in Epstein's framework, the analogical foundation that makes later deep competence more flexible and more capable of genuine insight than the early specialist alternative would have been. Sampling broadly, trying different kinds of work, developing competence across more than one area, maintaining exposure to multiple domains even as depth develops in one, is not the absence of career direction. It is the accumulation of the cognitive and experiential resources that genuine career depth eventually draws on. The second is to cultivate what Ibarra calls outsight, by treating work experiences as experiments rather than as tests of whether you've found the right calling. The question is not, is this my calling? A question that the calling model makes feel like it demands a binary answer. The question is, what am I learning about what kind of work I am capable of and what kind of work I find genuinely engaging? Those are empirical questions that experience answers directly. They do not require prior access to a calling. They require a willingness to gather, tighter by doing things and observing your responses. The third is to invest in developing craftsman capital in the domains where genuine competence is emerging, rather than waiting until the calling is found to make the investment. Newport's research is clear on this. The sense of purpose and meaning that meaningful work provides is primarily a product of the mastery, not a precondition for it. The investment in genuine competence, the deliberate practice, the accumulated knowledge, the development of skills that become genuinely rare and valuable is what creates the conditions for work to feel like a calling. It does not wait for the calling to feel worth making. The fourth, and most important for people who have spent significant time in the calling model's grip, is to reframe the absence of a calling as something other than failure or incompleteness. The Research does not suggest that some people have callings and others are simply searching. It suggests that the calling model is a misleading description of how meaningful professional lives actually develop. For most people, the person who has not found a single, clear, unambiguous calling is not behind schedule. They are in the same situation as most people who eventually build genuinely satisfying careers. They have simply not yet accumulated enough experience and mastery for the purpose that comes from genuine competence to have emerged. There is also a liberating dimension to the research that is easy to miss in the critique of the calling model. If callings are not discovered but built, if they are the product of accumulated investment rather than the revelation of pre-existing vocation, then the possibilities for finding work that is genuinely meaningful are considerably wider than the calling model suggests. The calling model constrains. It implies that there is one right answer that must be found. The investment model expands. It implies that genuine mastery in many different domains can produce the sense of purpose and meaning that meaningful work provides. The person who invests seriously in more than one kind of work is not failing to find their calling. They are building more than one potential source of the satisfaction that the calling model treats as uniquely singular. The myth of the one true calling is not an innocent mistake. It is a specific framework for thinking about work that produces specific and predictable harms, deferred investment while waiting for the calling to arrive, guilt about the presence of multiple interests, the chronic low-grade anxiety that any current path might not be the right one, replacing it with a more accurate account of how satisfying professional lives actually develop through exploration, experimentation, investment in competence, and the gradual emergence of purpose from mastery, is not just intellectually honest, it is practically useful in ways that the calling model, for all its romantic appeal, demonstrably is not. The next thread examines how work environments shape the experience of the work itself, what the research reveals about the specific environmental conditions under which people do their best work, and how to identify and create those conditions when you have some influence over them. Before continuing, consider the most meaningful work you have ever done. Was the meaning there from the beginning? Did you feel called to it before you started, or did the meaning emerge gradually as competence developed and the work became something you could do in ways you couldn't at the beginning? The answer is probably more relevant to understanding how meaningful work develops than any amount of abstract reflection about calling.